So being is one. No? Hindi mo yun matatanggal. Tapos naaral din natin that no, God is a perfect being in terms of unity kasi He's not divisible. No, the being of God is indivisible. And sa next topic natin which is distinction, again we cannot no, of all the beings, isa lang ang being na hindi mo pwedeng ilagay sa category ng distinction, and that is God. Kasi nga he is very metaphysically simple, and therefore distinction for God is not applicable. No, ang pwede mo lang mga distinguish is yung mga being na hindi pwede, na walang, what's the term? Walang, na pwedeng i-divide tulad ng man, no? Pwede mo tanggalin yung paa, yung kamay. So, yon. So, the individual, we said, is distinct from others. It is then necessarily to advert to distinction. So, there is a distinction when there is otherness. But distinctions are not the same. So, malalaman mo lang or pwede mo lang gawing ang distinction kung meron concept ng other. Kasi hindi mo pwedeng itignan ang differences, ang similarities ni Ivan tsaka ni Joshua kung hindi naman nag-exist si Joshua at the first place. So there has to be this other than the I, kailangan rin ng other na being para magkaroon ng distinction. So royal daw. Real distinction is the distinction between things or beings. Similarly, the distinction between different parts of a being or things, between different accidents of things is real. For example, the distinction between Pedro and Juan, and the distinction between the arm of Pedro and his leg. No, so yun. Parang sa beings lang din, no? There has to be something, ang pwede mo lang ma-distinguish sa real, in a real sense, is yung mga real beings lang din, no? Same with the concept ng logical distinction. Ang pwede mo lang scrutinize sa logical distinction are the beings that are logical, or tulad nung na lesson natin nung last, logical beings. So, yun. So, it is a distinction, yung sa logical distinction na tayo, no? Wala sa notes niyo yan, kaya makinig kayo. Is also traditionally called the distinction of reason. Why? Because it is a distinction introduced by and dependent of the mind. So, di ba yung logical being are beings that exist because of the mind or dependent on the mind. So, if the mind doesn't exist, the real being doesn't exist. And co-equally, a logical distinction cannot be done without the mind. So magkakaroon lang din ng logical distinction kapag merong mind. Just as there will only be existence of a logical being if there is an existence of the mind. Gets? Gets ba yun? Guys? Are you there?
Yes.
May questions about dun? So, ang distinctions dun, di ba, sa examples natin is no, concepts of square and triangle. Now, there's a distinction between the concept of a square and a triangle. So, a triangle can never be a square, and a square can never be a triangle. Therefore, there is already a distinction between these two forms of being. So, it even includes, sabi dito, mental constructions or mental existences like space, diba? Or evil, sabi niya dito. Which is, kung titignan natin, ang concept ng space and concept ng evil ay parehas na absences. 'Di ba? Yung ano bang evil ulit? The negation of goodness. So it's just the absence of goodness. Same with space. No, it's just the absence of no matter. So that's space. So yon. If the logical distinction has basis in reality, it is called a distinction of reason of the reasoned thing. So yun yung or for example, the distinction between the Archbishop of the See of Tugigraw and the Metropolitan of the Ecclesiastical Province. So the distinction is logical because the Archbishop is Tugigraw is in fact and by law, no? Tapos Metropolitan tawag dito of the Ecclesiastical Province, and it has a foundation of reality because as Archbishop, he presides over the See of Tugigraw. So, ang ibig niya lang sabihin is that if a logical distinction is something na pwede mo lang din i-distinct or is based in reality, no, kasi nga nag-i-exist din siya as a real being, then it is the distinction of reason of the reason thing. So, ang basis mo ngayon dun sa distinction mo is not on the mind, but instead on the being itself. So, yung distinction ngayon ng being is independent sa pag-iisip ko. It is dependent on the being itself kasi nga nag-i-exist yung being. Diba? Kasi nga, it can exist apart from my mind. Pero kung ang distinction naman ngayon is a logical distinction, diba? It is the distinction of reason of the reasoner. Meaning that yung being ngayon or yung distinction ng being nung nag-e-exist na being ngayon is dependent sa mind ko or dependent sa reason ko. Kaya nga, distinction of the reasoner of reason of the reasoner. Wait lang, mag-share. Gawa tayo ng whiteboard para mas maintindihan ninyo. Oo nga, pati rin ako, no? Sakit sa ulo. So, sabi ko kanina, kung ang isang distinction, which is to yung no? Ito yung real distinction. In-explain ko dito yung real distinction. If a real distinction is based on reality, no? Based on reality, it is a real distinction. No? Very logical yung word dito. Kaya nga real distinction kasi nga reality. So the root word there is real. Pero ang other term sa real distinction is the distinction of the distinction of reason, kakusan. The distinction of reason of the reason thing. Ibig sabihin, yung distinction ng being na yun, magbe-base sa akin, no? Based dun sa being. So, oo, tama. Sabi ni Sir Matt, given na siya. In other words, mag-e-exist yun na bagay. Kung for example, yung distinction ng cellphone na to, mag-e-exist yun kahit na wala ako nag-iisip. Kaya, ang root word yan is the reason thing. Ano yung reason thing? No? Ano yung thing na pinag-uusapan natin? No? Wala. Bura. Yung pinag-iusapan natin na the reason thing is the thing itself or the being itself. So that is real distinction. Logical distinction naman is it depends on my mind. Kaya nga, logical distinction is also called, ano yung isang tawag dito? Distinction of reason of the reasoner. Ibig sabihin, nagbe-base yung distinction ng being na yun sa akin. Kasi hindi mag-exist yung being na yun kung wala si reasoner. And sino yung reasoner? Ako. So, kung ang being is a logical being or something na existing lang sa isip, then its distinction also is dependent on the mind of the reasoner. So, yun ngayon yung difference ng real distinction and logical distinction. Gets? Masakit sa ulo, no? Oo, kasi it's subjective. No, sabi ni Sir Matt, example, may iba na tao gusto ang adobo, yung iba ayaw, and that is the distinction of the reasoner. Bakit? Kasi it's subjective. That just because your idea is different from my idea, hindi ibig sabihin mali na ako or ikaw na yung mali. Kasi nga, it is dependent on the mind. Ano? For example, sa distinction na to is the distinction between God and Yahweh. No, example sa notes. No, the distinction between God and Yahweh, no, is kasi nga they are just terms, so they exist, no, on the mind. And yun, is kunwari, paano ba? Concepts ng mga imagined na creatures, no? Anong difference ng center sa tikbalang? That is a logical distinction. Parehas silang half horse and half man, pero baliktad nga lang, no? Sa tikbalang, ang tao is yung katawan, ulo is yung kabayo. Sa center naman ngayon, the body is the man. Yung body is the horse naman ngayon, and the top is the human. So yun yung logical distinction kasi hindi naman mag-exist yung mga distinction na yun kung wala yung mind na nakaisip nun. Unlike dito, yung parang sabi niya, no, ano daw pagkakaiba ng sabi ng example dito, pagkakaiba ng Archbishop of Tuguegarao sa tawag dito, Metropolitan of the Ecclesiastical Province, which is the Archdiocese of Tuguegarao lang din, no? So, mag-exist sila kahit hindi ko sila isipin. Ibig sabihin, yung difference nila or yung distinction nila, mag-exist lang din, no? Is nakabase sa reason thing or nakabase sa dun sa being instead na sa akin na nag-iisip. So, yun yung difference ng logical distinction sa real distinction. Gets ba yun? Gets? Guys, nandyan pa kayo?
Yes, sir.
May tanong?
Sir,
Oh,
example pa nga sa real distinction.
real distinction na example. For example, gusto kong i-distinguish between si Gabi at si Ivan. No, yung distinction nilang dalawa, or sabihin mo ng si Stephen at si Ivan, yung distinction nilang dalawa is nakadependent sa kanila. Kasi nag-i-exist sila sa real life. Nag-i-exist sila in reality. Therefore, their distinction is based on the reason thing. No, or is based on the being na nag-i-exist, which is the reason thing. So, as long as it is a real being, yun yung una mong gagawin para makita mo kung yung distinction real ba o logical. Is the being real or logical? Diba? Is it real? Is it real? Pag ang being real, then the distinction is also real. And if the being is logical, then the distinction is also logical. So, ganun lang siya kung paano tignan whether it is a logical or a real distinction. So, yon. Okay ka na dun, Rene?
Yes, sir.
Oo. Or pwede mo rin kasing sabihin na anong pangalan ng mama mo, Rene? Rene?
Judeliza.
Ha? Ano?
Judeliza.
Daliza? O yun, sabi mo na lang na yung being na anak ng kung ano man yung pangalan ng papa ni Rene tsaka mama ni Rene is the same being, no? Na nag-aaral ng philosophy na estudyante ko, 'di ba? Na nagngangalang Rene Liza. So, yung basis ngayon nung distinction nung being na anak nung ni kung ano man yung pangalan ng parents mo, tsaka yung estudyante ko is a real distinction kasi hindi yun magbe-base sa akin, magbe-base yun sa'yo because you are a real being. Unlike kapag logical being naman ngayon, na yung distinction nakabase sa isip ko kasi hindi sila mag-exist kung wala ako na nag-iisip na kailangan nilang mag-exist. So, yun. Gets ba yung mga example? Or ano pa? Gets ba? Kasi a distinction can be talking about the same being. Di ba? Yung sinutukoy ko na anak ng kung ano man yung pangalan ng parents ni Rene, tsaka yung estudyante ko, is a distinction na kung saan isa lang yung tinutukoy ko. Pero a distinction can also talk about two beings na magkaiba. Kunwari, yung cellphone ko tsaka yung ballpen ko, they are two different beings. But their being or their distinction is real distinction kasi hindi sila pwedeng, yung basis nila is naka-base sa kanilang sariling being kasi nag-exist sila kahit na wala ako na nag-iisip na nag-exist sila. So, yon. Any questions doon? Oh, mas mahirap na naman yung susunod. No? Truth naman tayo ngayon. No? Gets ba yun? Para maka-move on na tayo kung truth, kung gets. Para next topic na. Gets? Nandyan pa kayo? Guys, wag niyong sabihin suko na kayo. Kalahating page pa lang yun. Kalahating page pa lang yun. My goodness. Basta ituloy natin. Panoorin nyo na lang. Kasi, tinignan ko, no, baka wala tayong pasok bukas. Kasi sabi nga ni Rene kanina, no, alam na alam niya pag holiday, no? Ang galing. Sabi niya, EDSA daw. So, yon. And sa Sabado, madami kasi kaming ginagawa para sa ACRE. So, baka hindi ko kayo mamit ng Sabado. Plus, walang pasok bukas. Kaya naghahabol din ako ng lesson. Kasi binilang ko yung natitirang pages. Kailangan every term, midterm, semis, and finals, makatapos tayo ng 2 pages per day. Kung twice a week lang tayo mag-meet. Eh kung hindi natin yun matapos, mapipilitan akong i-meet kayo ng 3 days a week kung mabagal tayo mag-lesson. Pero hopefully, naka 2 pages tayo ngayon, no? Or kahit 3 para next week 2 beses lang din tayo mag-meet. So, yon. Punta naman tayo ngayon sa ontological truth. Pero gets nyo ba yung logical tsaka real distinction? Gets? Oh, sige, questions. Kung example, para makapag-isip naman kayo. Makikita ko kung nag-gets ba ninyo o hindi. Anong uri ng distinction yung distinction between ano ba? Magandang example. yung upuan tsaka mesa dito sa CM. Now, is it a real distinction or a logical distinction? Sige nga.
Real.
O, real kasi nag-exist sila, no? So, ganun lang siya. Titignan mo muna kung real or logical, then saka mo ma-assess kung yung distinction eh real or logical lang din. So, yon. Punta naman ngayon tayo sa ontological truth. No, sabi dito, what is truth? Sabi dito sa notes natin, notes ko pala kasi wala pa kayong page 9. Truth is the capacity of being to be known. Para sa metaphysics, this is his definition of truth. No? Capacity of being, 'di ba? Kasi nga ang metaphysics is a philosophy of being as such, 'di ba? So, 'yan. Yan ang truth para sa metaphysics. So, any being can be the object, the source, or the measure. So, yun yung tatlong important terms, no? A being can be number 1, the object of truth. Object daw. So, sorry. Object of truth, or it could be the source of the truth, or number 3, the measure of the truth of the mind. So sabi dito, we are therefore in possession of the truth insofar as we are in possession of what is real. So as long as it is a being that is existing, then it can have a possession of this concept of truth or the capacity of being to be known. So as long as you are a being, you have the capacity to be known, to be the source of truth, and to be the measurement of that kung ano man yung gusto mong malaman na truth. So, yun. Sabi dito, being is equal to truth and is equal to reality. So, to think is to think of what is. To think of being, no? Thought, in other words, cannot be separated from being. To sum it all up, no? To think is something na hindi mo pwedeng utusan ang utak na hindi gawin. Oh, sige. May ipapagawa ako sa inyo. No? Gawin lang natin siya ng seconds lang. No? 3 seconds. May iutos ako, dapat nyong gawin. Okay. 1, 2, 3, go. Wag kayong mag-isip ng elephant or do not think of an elephant. Oh. Now, ang tanong, inisip nyo ba ang itsura ng elephant or hindi? Nung sinabi kong don't think of an elephant.
Inisip, sir.
Inisip nyo. That's what this is all about. Hindi mo pwedeng utusan ng utak na hindi mag-isip. Kasi nga, sabi dito, thought cannot be separated from being. If there's a being, there's a thought. So, precisely yun yung sense nitong sinasabi dito sa notes. No? So, being then, in its relation to the intellect, is truth. It makes sense to speak of truth only in reference to the mind from which there is truth. That is why it is a common Thomistic doctrine that truth is formally in the mind. Truth is in the mind and therefore called formal truth. So of course, sir. So ibig sabihin na yung truth sa mind lang nag-exist. Paano yung truth na kuan? No, 'di ba? Can truth not be I mean, ang truth ba hindi ba pwedeng maging subjective? Ano yun? Diyan pa, ma'am. Ang truth ba hindi pwedeng maging subjective? No? It's not the case. Truth, kasi na tinutukoy sa metaphysics is ontological truth. No? Ontological truth or ontological truth. Or sa Thomistic metaphysics, no? Formal truth. Or in other terms, the truth in the mind. So yan yung truth na pinag-uusapan natin dito. Gets ba? Gets? May tanong? Wala na. Wait lang. So yon. So it is obvious, however, that the mind, in order to be in the truth, depends on beings, on things, on what is. In this way, while truth is formally a matter of the mind, it is not possible without the truth, which is the being or object itself. And this is what is called metaphysical or ontological truth. So in short, yung truth na pinag-uusapan natin is truth na dependent sa mind or dependent sa being. Meaning na hindi mag-exist yung truth na pinag-uusapan natin kung walang being. Kasi wala nang mind na mag-iisip ng truth na yun kung walang being. Tanggalin mo lahat ng being sa mundo, including God, then there will be no truth. Kasi wala nang mag-iisip nung concept nung truth. No, kaya nga tinatawag to na sa metaphysics na ontological truth. So, in short, the foundation of truth is being. No? Foundation of truth is being. Some, of course, sa metaphysics. Ang basis lahat ng truth is sa being. And as long as the mind is in possession of what truly is. So like beings, di ba, there is a distinction between beings. There are forms of beings, di ba? Real beings, may kinds of beings, real beings, logical beings. Then meron din tayong distinction of being, no? Real distinction, logical distinction. Siyempre, meron din tayong kinds of truths. Oh. Nasa notes nyo na yan. Page 10 na tayo. Una is what we call the logical truth. Now, the truth of what one judges and the assertions or denials one makes. So, to judge means it should be between truth and falsity. Diba? Kaya nga judge. And to assert means to emphasize. No? Emphasize. So, yun ang logical truth. So, meaning, the logical truth is dependent on me, on you, on the being, or on the mind of the being. So, kapag hindi na nag-exist yung, kunwari, for example, no, para mas ma-concretize, yung truth, the truth of the existence of a centur or tikbalang dun sa example natin, they are logical truths because they are dependent on the mind as opposed to ontological truth. So ontological truth is the truth that the being or the thing is, no? Because the being is the source, the measure, and the object of the truth of the mind. Meaning that ontological truth compared to logical truth is a truth that will exist whether you're thinking of it or not. So the truth of, for example, a pencil that is existing is its own truth. Hindi mo pwedeng kontrahin yun because that's his truth. The truth of that being is dependent on his existence. Hindi tulad nung logical truth that their truth is dependent on the mind of those that thinks of it. And lastly, moral truth, the agreement between what one thinks and what one does and what one says. When this agreement is absent, in other words, when one says something deliberately contrary to what one thinks, one tells a lie. And lastly, epistemological or formal truth, the truth as found in the intellect, no. Sa isip lang siya. Kaya nga epistemological, no. No, epistemology, philosophy of knowledge, that's why it is the truth in the intellect. So, yon. Gets nyo ba yung mga kinds of truths? May tanong about dun? May tanong kayo dun, guys? Or any tanong kung sa mga naging na topic na natin, ganun? Or wala? Masyado kong,
Sir,
oh,
sir, example nga ulit dun sa ontological truths, sir.
ontological truth, ang example dyan is ikaw. For example, ikaw. The truth of you, Giselle, the source is you. The measure of you and the object or the being itself is you. Therefore, you are the truth about you, no, is a form of ontological truths. So yun yung example ng ontological truth. As long as it is an existing being, no, yun yung criteria. It should be an existing being for it to be an ontological truth. Yun. Parang yung concept ng God tsaka epistemological God or an evil tsaka ng epistemological evil, kung naalala nyo sa modern philosophy natin, 'di ba, ang epistemological evil is something or an evil that just only exists in the mind. No, the same with the concept of epistemological God. 'Di ba, yun yung kwan natin, defense natin against sa kung may magtatanong, no, kung if God created the world and the universe and all beings, then who created God? And then ang isasagot natin doon is that it is only applicable to a being that is created, no, or a being that or a God that is epistemological, no, a God that is created by man, a man-made God. But if it is a God that exists apart from the mind, which is not epistemological but an ontological, ibig sabihin hindi siya nag-exist sa mind ng tao. So yun naman ngayon yung epistemological na truth. Gets? May tanong pa? May tanong pa kayo? Ang tanong muna, na-gets nyo ba yung sa may distinctions tsaka sa truth natin? Basta ang tandaan nyo, the truth that we are talking about, hindi yung truth na parang abstract concept ng truth. Instead, it is the truth of the being. Kasi nga ang subject natin, metaphysics. So the truth of the being is our topic. No? Yun. Itong truths dito na nilagay it's to explain na ang pinag-uusapan natin is ontological truth or the truth of the being. Yun. Gets? Gets, guys? May tanong? Wala. So yun, kung wala, next topic na. So the basic reason that there is truth at all and that there is such a thing as knowledge is the ontological openness of man to being. The mind of man has an aptitude for truth. In fact, it goes after the truth. So the power to know comes from the source, the basic orientation of the mind to truth, to being. No, ang ibig niya lang sabihin ng phrase na yan is that the mind of man desires truth. The mind of man is towards truth. No? It wants to know the truth. So yun lang yung sinasabi niya. But then sabi dito, there are two kinds of minds. May dalawang isip ng mind. Ay, may dalawang forms daw ng minds. No? What's this? Yung two forms na yun is yung in connection to its relation, no? Relation to other kinds of being or in relation to its kung anong uri man siya ng being. So, una is yung in relation to the mind of man. So, the truth of a being is being as the source, the object, and the measure of the truth in the mind. Meaning it's related to the mind of man. But then there's another kind of truth there's another kind of truth which is in relation to the mind of God. So the truth of a being is its conformity with the creating mind of God. Insofar as a being exists, only because God brings it into existence, a being must conform to what God's intention or plan is. Meaning that the truth of a being, of a man, can, in a way, it can change. No? Pwede siyang magbago. But the truth in relation to the mind of God cannot change. So, the truth of in relation to the mind of man should conform to that of the truth of the mind of God. Pero yung mind of God, the truth in the mind of God is something na hindi pwedeng magbago. Siya dapat ang basis. Unlike sa man that the truth in the mind of man can change, but for God, it cannot be. No? So yun yung difference ng in relation to man and in relation to God. So gets ba yun? No, to put it in a perspective, yung truth sa mind ni God, that's the absolute truth. O, hindi yun pwedeng magbago. But the mind of man, kasi nga, it's finite, therefore, it can change. No? But nonetheless, it is still a form of truth. So, yun. So, in connection, no, naalala ko yung isang artwork. No, actually, para siguro sa inyo, you won't look at it as an artwork. But para sa kanya, it is a, what do you call this, yung mga sumisikat na artworks ngayon? Conceptual artwork. It's not a visual artwork. It's not a performance art. It's not a arts na nakikita ng senses. Instead, it's an art that the mind will understand. Ang ginawa niya is he posted a painting of a chair. And then dun sa baba ng painting ng chair, he posted the definition of a chair. And then dun sa tabi ng definition, nung printed na definition ng chair, naglagay siya ng totoong upuan. And then, he calls that artwork the chairness of a chair. And then, ang question ngayon, which of the three is a chair? 'Di ba? So alin dun sa tatlo ang chair? Yung nakasulat na definition, yung painting ng chair o yung chair mismo, 'di ba? So, the truth of those things, kasi nga mga finite being lang yung mga yon, they can change. But the truth in the mind of God cannot change. So it is absolute. So yun. Gets ba yun? So tapos na tayo sa tapos na tayo sa being as one and being as true. 'Di ba kung maalala nyo? No? Being as one yung una, or yung tinatawag natin na individuality, and then being as true, 'di ba? Lahat yung pinag-aaralan natin na logical, I mean, no, yung kinds of truth, no, kung saan siya, if it is an ontological, a formal. And ngayon naman pupunta na tayo sa being as good, no, or yung tinatawag natin na ontological goodness. So ontological goodness is the capacity of being to be desired. Kasi nga good. Now, balikan natin, no? Ang being na absolute one or absolutely united is God. The being that is absolutely true is God. And it follows that the being that is absolutely good is God. Kaya lang, kailangan pa rin nating pag-aralan kasi nga, no, not all beings are God. So, sabi dito, being in relation to the intellect is truth. But then being in relation to the will is good. No? If in connection to the intellect is that it's being as true, then in connection to the will, then it is, we now study the being as good. So the will, it should not be forgotten, is man's rational appetitive faculty, no? So definition of terms muna, appetitive faculty, the power to tend towards something perceived as good, or the power to desire. So yun yung appetitive faculty. Parang good sense lang, no? 'Di ba ang good sense? Syempre hindi niyo alam ang good sense. Ano ulit yung good sense? Ni Descartes, ano yung good sense?
The
Yung
ability of man to distinguish truth from falsehood.
tama, no? This is the ability of man to distinguish truth from falsehood. And in connection to that, ang appetitive faculty naman is the ability of man to perceive what is good, no, or the power to desire. So yun yung appetitive faculty of a man. So another term to be defined is rational. So the will is a rational power because in Thomistic anthropology, it is a power of the soul and is guided by the intellect. So yon. Kung ang intellect is sa truth, meaning it's in the side of the mind, no? Will on the others, wait, saan na yun? No, magka-connect lahat yan. Kasi if man has this appetitive faculty, therefore he is free, no? May concept ng freedom. Kasi hindi ka makakapili, or you will not have this power to desire kung wala kang choices na ide-desire. So yun. So the will desires a thing insofar as the thing possesses some perfection and is capable of enriching the person who desires it. So I desire food because of the nourishment it gives. The tending of the will towards things therefore uncovers another ontological dimension of a being, its goodness. And this is the attribute under study. So, ang goal naman ngayon ng goodness is that no, we tend to wanted something that is good. No, this reaching of the perfection of good is our goal. And of course, ang being lang na may perfection ng goodness is of course God. But then it doesn't mean that man, kaya nga ang, 'di ba sabi natin, ang mind ng man or the intellect of man will always desire for good, no? Intellect, no? Ang dinedesire niya is, ay good daw, is truth. 'Di ba? Co-equally, the will of man also, ang goal naman niya ngayon is goodness. If the intellect's goal is truth, then the will's goal is the concept of good or of what is good. So, gets ba yun? Gets? Goods? Goods? Hindi. O bad? Bad? 'Di ba? Ang goodness naman is that he just wants perfection, 'di ba? Parang concept siya ng beauty, 'di ba? The man will always have this subjective na pag-iisip na is tending towards the beautiful. And not just the beautiful, but tending towards what is good and what is true, of course. Kaya nga, hindi mo yun matatanggal. Kaya nga, ang being is, again, no, one, true, and good. So, yun. May tanong ba about dun? So, dun na lang muna tayo. No? Naka 2 pages tayo. Sad, 2 pages lang. May tanong?
Sir, yung rational nga.
Wala, dinefine niya lang yung term na rational dyan. Hindi naman kasi yan distinction, they are just trying to define terms. Sabi dito, ang rational is defined as kasi nga ang will, sabi niya, in connection to will, of course, will is a rational power, sabi niya. Or, wait. Yon, basta kasi there's a distinction between this will and intellect. No? Kung ang intellect, ang goal niya is truth, ang goal naman ngayon ng will is goodness. And it follows that therefore, to have this concept of will or to concept to desire means that it is a power of the mind, a power of the rational, no? Kapag isa siyang ability ng pag-iisip, no? Ability ng rationality natin is to have this will na tinatawag natin. So, yon. Gets ba yun? And of course, sabi niya, it is guided by the intellect. So now you see the connection between the intellect and the will. 'Di ba? So, yon. Gets yun? Gets ba yun? Gets? Kasi wala namang concept ng will kung syempre babalikan natin yung concept ng freedom. You cannot have the or the ability to desire kung wala kang pagpipilian. No, parang kumbaga sinabi mo no? Basta yun, wala ka ng pagpipilian pag ganun. So kung wala kang pagpipilian, then the ability to desire or the power of the will hindi na siya mag-exist. Kasi nga, wala ka naman ng choices. So, wala ka ng ability to desire. Or wala na yung ability mo na this goal towards the good. Kasi nga wala ka ng ibang choice kundi yun. No, kaya yun. Ano pa? May tanong pa? May tanong pa, guys? Guys? Yan pa kayo? Wala na? Okay na? Mag-content ulit tayo. 2, 4, 6, 7. Ay, 2, 4, 6, 8. Mag-content ulit tayo. Takulang kayo kanina. Attendance ulit. Para kompleto naman. Game. 1, 2, 3. Okay na. Yun. Wala na? Wala nang tanong? Kung wala na, mag-con na din tayo. Pray na para to end this class. So, glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Bye, guys. Ingat kayo.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Bye,
I-update
sir.
ko na
Thank
lang
you.
kayo
Bye, sir.
kung
Ingat
Salamat,
palagi,
sir.
sir.
kailan yung
Salamat,
next
sir.
meeting. Update ko na lang. Bye-bye. Stay
Bye.
safe.
Thank you, sir.